On June 28, 1980, at around 5:15 in the afternoon, a 38-year-old man named Robert Davidson was riding his motorcycle down Interstate 74 in Acton, Indiana. Acton was a very small, quiet community located just outside of Indianapolis, surrounded by farmland and open sky. Sitting right behind Robert on the seat of the motorcycle was his wife, Wanda. She had her arms wrapped tightly around his waist as they sped down the highway. The couple was trying to get to a family gathering, and they were in a huge rush. But their hurry was not just because they were excited to see their relatives. It was because the weather was taking a turn for the worse. Right above them, the sky had turned a dark, ominous shade of gray. The clouds looked heavy and threatening, and they knew a massive summer storm was about to break. Robert accelerated a bit, hoping they could somehow outrun the storm and make it to their destination before the skies opened up. But within seconds, huge, heavy raindrops began hitting his face and arms. He realized they were not going to make it. The rain was starting to come down fast and hard, and it was going to be impossible to keep riding safely without their rain gear. So, Robert decided to pull over onto the shoulder of Interstate 74. As soon as the motorcycle came to a stop on the gravel side of the road, Wanda quickly climbed off the back. Robert was about to get off the bike too, intending to open the small storage compartment on the back of the motorcycle to grab their rain jackets. But before he could even stand up, there was a sudden, blinding flash of light. In that exact instant, a tremendous surge of electricity ripped through Robert's body. Every single muscle in his body went completely rigid, locking up in intense pain. He didn't even have time to scream. He simply crumpled off the side of the motorcycle and collapsed onto the gravel, and then everything went completely black. Less than 5 minutes later, an ambulance arrived on the scene, and several first responders jumped out, including a woman named Kimberly Cobb. Kimberly had been briefed on the situation over the radio. A man and his wife had pulled over on the side of Interstate 74, and the man had been struck by lightning. As she ran up to the couple, she could see Robert lying on the ground, completely motionless. His skin was waxy and gray, showing no signs of life. His wife, Wanda, was in a complete state of shock, standing next to him and sobbing uncontrollably. Kimberly immediately jumped into action. She knelt down next to Robert and felt for a pulse, but there was absolutely nothing. At this point, Kimberly knew she only had a couple of minutes to try to revive Robert, or he would be gone forever. She worked quickly to stabilize Robert's spine while one of her team members began performing CPR. A third responder jumped back onto the ambulance radio and called for an emergency medical helicopter to fly Robert to a hospital as soon as possible. They quickly got a response from the helicopter crew confirming they were on their way. But before the first responders could communicate any further, something impossible happened. Their ambulance just completely shut down. The lights, the sirens, and the engine all turned off at the exact same time, leaving the scene in dead silence. This was a massive crisis because some of the medical equipment they needed to keep Robert alive required the ambulance's electrical system to be running. With the vehicle completely dead, that equipment was totally useless. This was incredibly confusing to Kimberly and the other responders. Ambulances are specially built with redundant systems so they never experience a total power failure. They are equipped with two separate batteries, a primary and a backup, specifically so that if one dies, the other takes over to keep the life-saving equipment active. The idea that both batteries had failed simultaneously was completely unheard of, but before the crew could even begin to process what was happening, they saw something else that made them freeze. Out of the darkness of the storm, a woman dressed in a long, old-fashioned black dress was running up the desolate highway toward them. She was charging forward, waving a Bible high above her head and screaming at them to let her touch Robert so she could save him. Neither the first responders nor Wanda had any idea who this woman was or where she had come from. The scene was completely surreal. The ambulance was dead, they had no way to use their equipment, they could not communicate with the incoming helicopter, and Robert was clinically dead on the ground. There was absolutely nothing they could do but wait. So, when this strange woman approached, none of the responders tried to stop her. They looked at Wanda, who was just as stunned, and they simply stood back and allowed the woman to crouch down next to Robert's body. The woman in black began a bizarre ritual. At first, she simply knelt over Robert and prayed quietly, holding her Bible. But as the moments passed, she became incredibly animated. She began slamming her Bible onto the ground over and over again, screaming up at the sky, demanding that the heavens save Robert's life. Kimberly and the others watched in absolute shock. It was as if the woman had become completely possessed. She raised the Bible over her head, opened her mouth, and began speaking in what sounded like complete gibberish, uttering strange tongues that made no sense to anyone listening. Just as the responders began to get frightened and were preparing to step in and pull her away, the woman suddenly stopped. She fell silent, stood up slowly, turned around, and began walking back down the desolate road in the direction she had come. Within seconds of her walking away, the ambulance suddenly roared back to life. The lights, sirens, and engine all came back on as if nothing had ever been wrong with them. And then, right there on the ground, Robert took a deep breath. Kimberly, the other responders, and Wanda stared at Robert in utter disbelief. He had been dead with no heartbeat for several minutes, yet here he was, breathing and returning to life without any medical intervention. The only thing that had happened was the bizarre ritual performed by the woman in black. Before anyone could make sense of what they had just witnessed, the medical helicopter arrived, and the scene turned into a chaotic rush to get Robert loaded inside. Seconds later, the helicopter took off, carrying Robert and Wanda away to the hospital. Kimberly and her team were left standing on the shoulder of Interstate 74 in the sudden quiet, completely stunned. They all knew there was no logical explanation for what had occurred. When they looked down the long, empty highway to find the woman in black, she was completely gone. The road was a straight, open stretch with a massive, empty field beside it. There was nowhere to hide, and she could not have walked out of sight in such a short amount of time. But she had vanished into thin air. Later on, the responders would learn that the empty field beside that stretch of highway held a deep, historical significance. That field had once been the site of the Acton Campground, a Methodist community in the 1800s. The members of that community were famous for their incredibly loud, intense prayer style and their practice of speaking in tongues. Tragically, the entire community burned to the ground in 1864. They rebuilt it, but in 1905, another massive fire destroyed it completely. This time, they abandoned the land, and it eventually became the empty field that ran alongside Interstate 74. When the story of Robert's miraculous survival spread, many locals began to believe that the woman in black was actually a ghost from the old Acton campground, drawn out by the storm to perform one last miracle. No one ever saw the woman in black again, but Robert Davidson made a full recovery. In the spring of 2017, a 21-year-old man named Antonio Navarrete was living in Wama, Florida, and felt like his life was absolutely perfect. Just a year earlier, he had met the love of his life, a young woman named Daisy Martinez, and now Daisy was pregnant. They were both incredibly excited about starting a family together. For the time being, they lived with Antonio's parents in his quiet, rural hometown just south of Tampa. Antonio had a very bright future ahead of him. Ever since he had graduated high school, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be an auto mechanic. He had been obsessed with cars since he was a toddler, taking apart his toys and putting them back together. As he got older, he drew highly intricate sketches of custom cars and spent his teenage years tinkering under the hoods of real vehicles. Eventually, he bought a white Chevy lowrider pickup truck that he nicknamed Casper. He customized Casper with fancy lights, special rims, and an enormous sound system that took up almost his entire back seat. It was actually because of this truck that Antonio, who was usually far too shy to talk to girls, met Daisy in the first place. He had driven Casper to a local car meetup, and while walking around, he saw Daisy standing on the far side of the lot. He couldn't stop staring at her, and when she looked up and smiled, they immediately hit it off. Not long after Daisy moved in with Antonio's family, the couple announced the pregnancy, and then Antonio got some more great news. He had landed a high-paying maintenance job at the Tampa Electric Company's Big Bend power plant in Apollo Beach, Florida. This job paid $12 an hour, which was double what he was used to making. With this money, he and Daisy would finally be able to save up and get a place of their own before the baby was born in the fall. Friends had told him the job was incredibly easy, mostly consisting of riding around on golf carts and keeping the facility clean. On June 24th, Antonio drove Casper to his first day of work, glancing happily at a photo of Daisy taped to his dashboard. When he arrived, he was amazed by the sheer size of the power plant. It was a massive industrial factory right on the water, with 4 giant smokestacks billowing white smoke. The plant produced electricity by burning coal inside 4 12-story tall ovens called boilers. The coal would burn at the bottom of these boilers, creating steam that rose up to turn massive turbines, generating power. Because 3 of the 4 units at Big Bend were built in the 1970s, they were older models that did not capture the airborne ash inside the boilers. Instead, the ash would get heated to such extreme temperatures that it melted into a substance called slag, which is essentially molten lava. This red-hot slag would drain through a man-sized hole at the bottom of the boiler into a 30-foot-tall water tank called a cooling tank. The water would instantly cool the slag, turning it into glassy black rocks that settled at the bottom, where a grinding mechanism would crush them into small chips to be sold for industrial use. Antonio spent his first few days doing routine safety training and learning his way around the loud, complicated factory maze. On June 29th, just 4 days into his new job, Antonio woke up in an excellent mood. The next day, he and Daisy were scheduled to get an ultrasound to find out the gender of their baby. He kissed Daisy goodbye, hopped into Casper, and drove to work. A few hours later, Antonio's mother was at the grocery store when she realized she had a missed call and a voicemail from Antonio. When she played the message, she heard something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Earlier that afternoon, 2 serious problems had occurred simultaneously inside Unit 2 of the power plant. Inside the boiler, the molten slag had formed a plug over the drainage hole, causing the heavy, lava-like substance to build up rapidly inside the 12-story oven. Meanwhile, down in the cooling tank, several large pieces of cooled slag had jammed the grinding mechanism at the bottom. To fix these issues safely, the company was supposed to shut down the boiler entirely, which was an incredibly expensive process. To save money, management decided to attempt the repairs while the boiler was still running and actively burning coal at over 1,000 degrees. At 4 in the afternoon, a senior plant manager gathered 5 workers, including Antonio, to perform the high-risk repair. The plan was to drain the cooling tank and open a maintenance access point called the doghouse door at the bottom of the tank. From there, the workers would use high-pressure water cannons to blast the blockage off the grinding mechanism. Antonio's only role was to stand back and clean up any water or debris that spilled out during the process. He stood about 15 feet back from the doghouse door, watching the other men work. But because the boiler was still running, the molten slag inside was continuing to melt and build up. It grew heavier and heavier by the minute. About 20 minutes into the repair, the immense weight of the built-up slag suddenly broke through the plug at the bottom of the boiler. Thousands of gallons of red-hot molten lava came rushing down into the empty cooling tank, hit the back wall, and exploded outward through the open doghouse door like a tidal wave of fire. The 6 men were instantly engulfed in a wave of molten slag. Within seconds, the floor was covered in 6 inches of glowing lava. In a panic, the men tried to run, but the extreme heat instantly melted their shoes, their skin, and their bones directly into the slag, trapping them in place. As his body was consumed by the fire, Antonio managed to pull his phone from his pocket and call his mother. She didn't answer, and in the agonizing final moments of his life, Antonio left a voicemail saying, "Mom, I'm burning. Please call the cops, please, Mom." In the background of the call, all that could be heard was the deafening hiss of escaping steam and pouring slag. 5 of the 6 men, including Antonio, were killed in the disaster. Tampa Electric was heavily fined and eventually paid out massive settlements to the families of the victims. On the afternoon of July 29, 2016, a 23-year-old college student named Felix was standing in the break room of an industrial manufacturing company in northwestern Germany. Felix was studying engineering and worked as a machine mechanic during his school breaks to make some extra money. Because of his age, he often felt out of place among his older, full-time coworkers. He poured himself a bowl of cereal, grabbed his carton of lactose-free milk from the communal fridge, and sat down at a table with 2 older workers named Otto and Klaus. Klaus was a quiet, antisocial man who rarely spoke to anyone, and the silence at the table was incredibly uncomfortable. Trying to be friendly, Felix asked how their day was going. Klaus simply shrugged and ignored him, but Otto looked up with a painful grimace and said he was having a terrible day. He complained that his head and stomach were hurting and that he felt completely exhausted. Felix offered his sympathy, and they finished their lunch in silence. A few minutes after returning to the factory floor, Felix was suddenly hit by a wave of excruciating stomach cramps. He assumed he must have accidentally consumed dairy, but when he checked the fridge, his lactose-free milk was the only carton there. As severe nausea washed over him, Felix realized he was too sick to stay. He drove home, threw up in the toilet, and went to wash his face. As he held the towel, he noticed a strange tingling numbness spreading through his fingers. Over the next 2 weeks, Felix's condition grew steadily worse. His doctor believed he was simply overworked and prescribed rest and vitamins, but the numbness soon spread all the way up his arms. One morning, as he tried to walk to the bathroom, his legs refused to cooperate. He kept slipping and losing his balance, eventually collapsing to the floor and having to crawl back to his bed. Terrified, he called his mother to take him to the hospital. At the hospital, a neurologist ran a series of tests but could find no obvious cause for Felix's symptoms. An imaging scan revealed that his brain and brainstem were severely inflamed, but all tests for infections came back negative. The doctor suspected an autoimmune reaction and administered anti-inflammatory medication, but it did nothing. Within a week, Felix's face was swollen, his eyes were glazed, and he was barely conscious. When the neurologist asked how he felt, Felix could only whisper the words metal mouth and taste water, indicating a metallic taste in his mouth. Baffled and unable to help, the neurologist had Felix transferred to a major university hospital. At the university hospital, Felix's condition continued to deteriorate as his kidneys and liver began to fail. By September, he had slipped into a vegetative state and doctors were completely at a loss. However, one dedicated specialist refused to give up. He began searching through decades of obscure medical journals, looking for any recorded cases with this exact progression of symptoms. Finally, he found a match. It was an incredibly rare condition that had only been recorded 3 times in the entire world over the last century. To confirm his theory, the doctor ordered a specific blood test, and the results came back positive. But rather than feeling relieved, the doctor was absolutely horrified. The diagnosis was a death sentence for Felix, and it meant that someone was actively trying to kill him. The doctor immediately contacted the police. The diagnosis was acute, severe mercury poisoning. Investigators launched a massive probe testing Felix's home, food, and water, but they found no trace of the poison. For 2 years, the case remained cold and Felix remained in a coma. Then, in May of 2018, things took a dark turn at the manufacturing plant. Otto, the coworker who had complained of a headache during that lunch with Felix, went into complete kidney failure and had to start dialysis 3 times a week. Another young worker named Elias began suffering from identical crippling stomach pains. The mystery was finally solved when Elias sat down to eat his lunch in the break room. He looked down at his sandwich and noticed a strange gray powder sprinkled across the top of it. He immediately notified management, who called the police. Investigators searched the home of Klaus, the quiet coworker who had sat with Felix and Otto on the day Felix first fell ill. In Klaus's basement, police discovered a sophisticated chemical laboratory filled with highly toxic substances, including mercury, lead, and cadmium. It turned out that Klaus had been systematically poisoning his coworkers' food for years just to watch them suffer. Klaus was sentenced to life in prison, and tragically, Felix passed away after spending 3 years in a vegetative state. In the spring of 1883, a young woman named Sarah was tidying up her small farmhouse in Eagle Creek, Arizona. She lived there with her sister, Elizabeth, their husbands, and their 4 children. Life on the Arizona frontier was incredibly dangerous, so the family lived together for mutual protection. On this particular afternoon, Elizabeth grabbed a wooden bucket and went outside to collect water from a nearby spring, while Sarah stayed inside with the kids. Suddenly, the family's dogs began barking frantically in the yard. Sarah walked onto the front porch to see what was causing the commotion. The dogs were staring in terror at a large sandy hill in front of the property. Sarah watched a massive, bizarre creature emerge over the crest of the hill. It was a giant 4-legged animal with thick red fur and a distorted hump back. But what terrified Sarah was the rider. It appeared to be a man, but his face was completely skeletal, with no eyes in his sockets and a horrific, wide grin. Believing she was witnessing the devil on a demonic beast, Sarah ran inside, barricaded the door with the kitchen table, and huddled with the children in prayer. Moments later, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the direction of the spring. Sarah was too terrified to move, and she stayed hidden for hours. That evening, the sisters' husbands returned from the fields and found Sarah barricaded inside. When they heard her story, they grabbed their lanterns and rifles and rushed out to the spring. There, they found Elizabeth lying dead in the dirt, surrounded by massive, unusual hoofprints. She had been trampled to death. The local coroner was called, but he was unable to identify the tracks, noting only that they were far too large to belong to a horse. He officially ruled the cause of death as unknown, but the story of the red monster and its skeletal rider spread rapidly across the frontier, and the entity became known as the Red Ghost. For the next 10 years, numerous campers and cowboys reported terrifying encounters with the Red Ghost. Some claimed it trampled their tents in the middle of the night, while one cowboy even tried to lasso it, only to be dragged through the desert. Finally, a farmer in eastern Arizona spotted the creature eating turnips in his field. He grabbed his rifle and shot it dead. When the townspeople gathered to examine the carcass, the mystery was finally solved. The Red Ghost was actually an escaped camel. In the mid-1800s, the United States military had imported camels from the Mediterranean to help haul supplies across the southwestern deserts, but several had escaped into the wild. The terrifying rider was not a demon, but the actual decomposing corpse of a man. At some point, the man had been tied securely to the camel's saddle in an upright position, possibly by comrades trying to keep his body from being lost. After he died, the camel had roamed the desert for a decade, and as the man's body decayed, his face lost its flesh, creating the eyeless, grinning skull that had terrified the settlers of Arizona. One evening in February of 2011, a quiet man in his 30s named Yang was eating dinner with his 5 elderly aunts in a remote village in China. Yang had been born with a severe speech impediment and was blind in one eye, which made him an easy target for bullies in his village. Because of this, he lived a highly isolated life, and the only people who ever showed him love and kindness were his 5 elderly aunts. They ate their meals in complete silence, which Yang preferred. On this night, after helping one of his aunts to bed, Yang heard the unfamiliar sound of police sirens echoing at the bottom of the hill. Yang walked outside and saw 2 police cars parked about 600 feet away. He watched from a distance as a local farmer wept hysterically while speaking to the officers. The farmer explained that for the past week, he had been plagued by a recurring nightmare in which his deceased mother was calling out for his help before disappearing into darkness. Disturbed by the dreams, the farmer had finally gone to check on his mother's grave, only to find that the soil had been freshly dug up and her coffin was completely empty. The police began a door-to-door search of the village, which eventually led them to Yang's home, a modified cave on the side of the hill. When they entered the dark, silent dwelling, they noticed a foul odor. They made their way to the back room, where they found Yang's 5 aunts lying in their beds. However, as the officers approached, they realized that none of the women were breathing. It was revealed that Yang did not actually have 5 living aunts. The elderly women of the village, who had been kind to him, had all died of natural causes over the years. Unable to cope with the loss of the only people who cared about him, Yang had systematically dug up their bodies from the local cemetery, brought them to his cave and placed them in beds, continuing to feed, dress, and care for them as if they were still alive. Yang was arrested and placed in a psychiatric facility, and the bodies were returned to their proper graves. On the evening of Friday, January 12, 2007, a 19-year-old college freshman named Wade Steffi was having dinner in the Ford Dining Hall on the campus of Purdue University in Indiana. Wade was an exceptionally bright student, attending the university on a full academic scholarship to study aviation technology. After dinner, he visited some friends at Owen Hall, a nearby dormitory, before heading to a fraternity party off campus around 9:30. He spent several hours at the party, but around midnight he realized he had left his jacket back in the dormitory. Wade walked back to Owen Hall alone in the cold. Because the dormitory doors lock automatically at night, he tried calling several friends to let him in, but he was unable to reach anyone. When he knocked on the front glass doors of the dorm, a student inside deemed him too intoxicated and refused to let him in. Frustrated, Wade walked around to the side of the building, looking for another way to enter. He discovered an unlocked door located at the bottom of a concrete maintenance pit, surrounded by a metal railing. Wade climbed over the railing, jumped down into the pit, and opened the door. The room inside was pitch black and filled with the low hum of heavy machinery. To prevent the door from locking behind him, Wade took off one of his shoes and wedged it into the door frame, then stepped further into the dark room. As he felt his way through the darkness, Wade squeezed into a narrow space between the wall and a massive electrical transformer. In his disoriented state, he tripped and reached out to steady himself. His fingers slipped into a small, 2-inch opening on the side of the transformer, making contact with an exposed high-voltage conductor. Wade was instantly electrocuted and killed because his body was wedged tightly in the narrow space. He did not fall to the ground. A massive search was launched, but because the maintenance room was off-limits, no one thought to look inside. Even when his shoe was found near the door, investigators only glanced into the room from the doorway and did not see his body wedged behind the machinery. 2 months later, a maintenance worker heard a loud popping sound coming from the room, which was the sound of the electrical current grounding through Wade's decomposing body. Wade was finally discovered, and Purdue University was found negligent for leaving the high-voltage room unlocked, resulting in a large settlement for his family. In the early 1980s, John Harder was a highly popular athletic 17-year-old student at his high school in Delaware, Ohio. John was known for his warm personality and his love of harmless, fun pranks. He was set to graduate on June 5, 1983, with plans to attend Kent State University. On Friday, May 13th, John and 20 of his classmates drove to Kings Island Amusement Park for a special high school graduation night event. During the 2-hour drive, John drank a large amount of alcohol and arrived at the park heavily intoxicated. Shortly after entering, he got into a heated, emotional argument with his girlfriend, Pam. Upset and angry, John walked away from his friends around 9 o'clock, and when the park closed at midnight, he was nowhere to be found. His worried friends waited by the cars, but John never appeared, and the park's security eventually locked the gates. An investigation later revealed that after leaving his friends, John had stumbled toward the park's replica of the Eiffel Tower. The structure stood 300 feet tall with a public staircase leading to a viewing platform 50 feet up. Beyond that platform, a 6-foot security gate blocked the stairs to keep visitors from climbing any higher. John, disoriented and highly intoxicated, climbed over the security gate and continued up the dark stairs in the middle of the night. As he climbed higher into the steel framework of the tower, he lost his footing and fell from the high structure, landing inside the tower's base mechanism, resulting in his instant death. His body was discovered by park staff the following morning, leaving his family, classmates, and the community devastated. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.